The surgeon closed the operating room door and said, "This isn't a medical procedure. It's an organ harvesting operation for buyers who've already paid." I was strapped to the operating table with leather restraints around my wrists and ankles, staring up at fluorescent lights that burned too bright against sterile white ceiling tiles. Dr. Raymond Keeler stood above me in full surgical scrubs, his mask pulled down to reveal a face I'd trusted completely 3 hours ago, when he'd explained that my appendectomy would be routine and low risk. Now his expression carried no warmth, only clinical detachment as he adjusted instruments on a tray beside my head. The anesthesia they'd given me wasn't working properly. I could feel everything, think clearly, but my body refused to respond to commands. Paralyzed but conscious, the worst possible combination. My heart monitor beeped faster as panic set in, and Keeler glanced at the screen with mild interest before returning his attention to surgical preparation. I tried to speak, to scream, to move anything, but my vocal cords were frozen and my limbs felt encased in concrete. "You're experiencing the effects of a paralytic agent combined with minimal sedation," Keeler explained while laying out scalpels in precise rows. "We need you conscious enough to maintain organ viability, but immobilized to prevent complications during extraction. Your appendix is fine, Mr. Novak. It always was. The CT scan I showed you was from a different patient, selected specifically because the inflammation patterns matched symptoms you'd been experiencing." He pulled his surgical mask back into place and moved toward the table where a nurse I'd never seen before was preparing additional instruments. She was younger than the nurses who'd prepped me earlier, with cold eyes that avoided making contact with mine. Every piece of equipment gleamed under the lights, surgical precision meeting systematic horror. I'd come to Metropolitan Medical Center this morning because of abdominal pain that had been getting progressively worse over 3 days. The emergency room doctor had been concerned enough to order imaging, and Keeler had reviewed the results personally, recommending immediate surgery. "Your tissue typing was completed 2 weeks ago when you came in for that routine physical," Keeler continued, speaking as if conducting a medical lecture rather than explaining planned murder. "Blood work, genetic markers, full compatibility screening disguised as standard preventive care. You matched perfectly with 3 different buyers who've been waiting for suitable donors. Your kidneys will go to a pharmaceutical executive in Dubai who's been on dialysis for 18 months. Your liver goes to a defense contractor in Singapore whose cirrhosis has progressed beyond transplant list eligibility. Your heart is the premium item, purchased by a media mogul in Hong Kong whose congenital defect has finally reached critical failure." The casual recitation of my body being divided and sold made me want to vomit, but even that autonomic function was suppressed by whatever drugs they'd pumped into my system. Keeler moved to a computer terminal and pulled up files containing photographs and medical records. I could see faces of wealthy individuals, financial transactions, shipping logistics for organ transport. "The total value of your organs on the private market is approximately $8 million, Keeler said while reviewing the files. Each buyer paid premium rates for guaranteed compatibility and expedited delivery. The surgeries are already scheduled in 3 different countries, with transplant teams standing by for organs that will arrive within optimal preservation windows." His matter-of-fact tone suggested this was routine business rather than premeditated murder. I forced my eyes to track movement around the room, looking for anything that might help. The nurse was preparing IV lines that would presumably keep my organs perfused during extraction. A second person in scrubs entered through a side door, male and significantly larger than Keeler, probably there for heavy lifting or physical security if complications arose. No one was coming to help. The emergency room staff who'd admitted me thought I was in legitimate surgery. My phone was locked in a storage locker with my clothes. I told my brother Austin I'd text him after the procedure, but he wouldn't expect to hear from me for hours. "You're probably wondering how long this has been going on," Keeler said, while checking my vital signs on the monitor. "Metropolitan Medical has been running this program for 11 years. We've processed 64 donors through this facility, all selected through emergency admissions or routine procedures that provided cover for unexpected complications. The hospital administration believes there's been an unfortunate series of surgical deaths, but mortality rates are within acceptable statistical variance for a facility this size. No one questions it because I've built a reputation for taking high-risk cases that other surgeons refuse." He adjusted the IV drip, and I felt cold liquid spreading through my veins. "That injection will keep your organs viable longer during transport. Premium buyers pay extra for optimal preservation, and we pride ourselves on quality control." The casual professionalism made everything worse. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperate circumstances. This was industrial-scale murder, organized with corporate efficiency. I tried to remember everything about the past 2 weeks that might have seemed unusual. The routine physical had been unremarkable at the time, basic blood work, standard questions about medical history, gentle palpation of major organ systems. Keeler had been friendly and reassuring, making jokes about turning 40 and the importance of preventive care. He'd recommended I come back in 6 months for follow-up. Now I understood he'd been evaluating me as livestock, checking product quality before offering it to premium buyers. The abdominal pain that had driven me to the emergency room had probably been real, maybe food poisoning or mild infection, but it had provided the perfect opportunity for Keeler to manufacture urgency around a fake appendicitis diagnosis. I'd been so grateful that he'd agreed to operate immediately, thinking I was lucky to have a surgeon of his reputation available. Instead, I'd walked voluntarily into an abattoir. The paralytic will wear off in approximately 8 hours, Keeler continued, which is irrelevant since the procedure takes roughly 4 hours from initial incision to final organ extraction. You'll lose consciousness from blood loss long before we finish, probably around the 2-hour mark when we begin liver resection. That's typically when blood pressure drops below sustainable levels. He spoke with the clinical detachment of someone describing a mechanical process rather than a human being's final hours. I could feel tears running down my temples toward my ears, the only physical response my body could still produce. Keeler noticed and used a cloth to wipe them away, a gesture that might have seemed compassionate if not for the context. Most donors cry, he observed. It's a natural response to understanding your situation. Some try to bargain, offering money or pleading about family members who need them. But the paralytic prevents verbal communication, which is actually a mercy. I've found that listening to people beg becomes tedious after the first few times. The nurse finished preparing the IV lines and began sterilizing my abdomen with antiseptic solution. The cold liquid on my skin was another reminder that my nervous system still functioned, even if voluntary muscle control didn't. I could feel everything, which meant I'd feel the scalpel when it cut through skin, the retractors pulling my abdominal cavity open, the systematic removal of organs while my brain remained conscious enough to process the violation. The cruelty of keeping me aware seemed deliberately designed for maximum suffering. Keeler positioned a rolling tray with surgical instruments next to the operating table, and I could see scalpels, clamps, retractors, bone saws for accessing organs behind the ribcage, everything necessary for complete systematic disassembly of a human body. We'll start with the kidneys since they're easiest to access, Keeler explained, apparently committed to narrating the process. Then liver, followed by cardiac harvest, which requires more extensive dissection. Your corneas, skin grafts, and bone tissue will be processed separately for additional buyers. We waste nothing. The door opened, and another person entered, this one wearing business attire rather than surgical scrubs. She was in her 50s with severe features and carried a tablet computer. Dr. Keeler, the Hong Kong buyer wants confirmation that extraction will proceed on schedule. His surgical team is ready to receive the heart within 6 hours. Her tone was professional, discussing organ transport logistics, the way someone might coordinate package delivery. Keeler glanced at his watch and nodded. Tell them we're beginning now. Preservation protocols are in place, and transport will depart within 4 hours. The organ will arrive well within optimal transplant window. The woman made notes on her tablet and left without ever looking at me. Another person who'd normalized murder as routine business operations. I was a commodity, a collection of parts to be harvested and distributed to the highest bidders. The dehumanization was complete. You should know this isn't personal, Keeler said while preparing the first incision site. We don't select donors based on dislike or revenge. It's purely utilitarian. You matched the genetic requirements for 3 high-value buyers who were willing to pay premium prices. Your emergency admission provided the perfect opportunity for a clean extraction with minimal investigation afterward. The medical examiner who'll review your death certificate is part of our network and will rule it a surgical complication. Your family will be told that unexpected internal bleeding and organ failure occurred during what should have been routine surgery. They'll receive a formal apology and a settlement offer that most accept rather than pursuing litigation. The systematic nature of the cover-up suggested years of refinement. This wasn't amateur crime, but professional operation with multiple fail-safes. I thought about Austin receiving news that I'd died on the operating table. He'd be devastated and probably blame himself for not being there, for letting me go to the hospital alone. The nurse handed Keeler a scalpel, and I watched him position it above my abdomen, preparing for the first cut. My heart rate spiked on the monitor, and alarms began beeping. Keeler paused and adjusted something on the anesthesia machine, probably increasing whatever was keeping me paralyzed. Elevated heart rate is normal during initial incision, he said calmly. The body recognizes trauma even when the brain can't communicate distress, but your cardiovascular system is strong, which is why you're such a valuable donor. Your heart will sustain someone else for decades. The rationalization made me sick. He was framing systematic murder as altruistic organ donation, as if my unwilling sacrifice somehow served a greater good. The blade pressed against my skin, and I felt pressure building, then the sharp bite of metal cutting through flesh. Blood welled around the incision site, and the nurse used suction to maintain visibility. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, beyond anything I'd experienced. My vision started to blur as shock set in, the body's desperate attempt to protect consciousness from trauma it couldn't escape. Keeler worked methodically, expanding the incision and using retractors to expose my abdominal cavity. I could feel hands inside my body, fingers probing organs, the violation so complete that my mind started fracturing. Part of me wanted to retreat into unconsciousness, to escape through mental shutdown if physical escape was impossible. But the drugs kept me trapped in awareness, forced to experience every stage of my own dismemberment. Kidneys look excellent, Keeler announced to the nurse. No visible scarring or damage. The Dubai buyer will be pleased. He began the process of isolating the renal arteries and preparing for extraction. Each step was explained in clinical detail, as if he was teaching a surgical resident rather than murdering someone. The absurdity would have been darkly funny if not for the excruciating reality. I tried to focus on anything other than what was happening to my body. I thought about Austin and our childhood, growing up in foster care after our parents died in a car accident. Austin had always protected me, 5 years older and fiercely defensive of his younger brother against other kids who tried to bully the foster system orphans. He'd worked construction to help pay for my college education, sacrificing his own opportunities so I could get a degree in engineering. I'd promised him I'd pay him back once I had a stable career, that we'd buy a house together, and finally have the family stability we'd never had as kids. Now I'd die on this operating table, and Austin would face that loss alone, another person torn from his life without warning or explanation. The injustice burned hotter than the physical pain. I'd done nothing to deserve this fate except have compatible organs and bad timing with an emergency admission. Keeler removed the first kidney and placed it in a preservation container that the nurse had ready. She sealed it and attached monitoring equipment before placing it in what looked like a high-tech cooler. "First organ secured," she announced. "Dubai transport is standing by." The process repeated for the second kidney, and I felt the absence in my body, the unnatural lightness where organs should be. Blood pressure was dropping according to the monitor alarms, and Keeler adjusted IV drips to keep me alive long enough to harvest the remaining organs. "We're making excellent time," he said with satisfaction. "The liver extraction should proceed smoothly." He began the more complex process of isolating the hepatic arteries and bile ducts, preparing to remove my liver while somehow maintaining enough circulation to keep my heart viable. The technical complexity was impressive in the most horrifying way possible. This required surgical skill and anatomical knowledge, professional expertise corrupted and weaponized for profit. The liver removal took longer and involved more extensive dissection. I could feel consciousness starting to slip as blood loss reached critical levels. My vision tunneled and sounds became distant, as if I was hearing everything through water. Keeler's voice was saying something about cardiac harvest needing to proceed immediately to preserve the heart. The nurse prepared additional equipment while the large man in scrubs positioned a bone saw. They were going to open my chest cavity and remove my heart while I was still technically alive, the final violation that would end whatever remained of my consciousness. But then, the operating room door burst open and people in FBI tactical gear poured through, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. Keeler stepped back from the table with his hands raised, surgical tools still dripping with my blood. The nurse and security guard were forced to the floor and restrained. Someone cut the straps holding me to the table while another person pressed gauze against the incisions to slow bleeding. "We need emergency medical," a woman's voice called into a radio. "Victim is critical with multiple organs harvested and severe blood loss. Get a trauma team here immediately." I tried to focus on her face, but everything was blurry and fading. She was young, maybe early 30s, wearing an FBI vest over tactical gear. "Stay with me," she urged, applying pressure to slow bleeding. "Help is coming. Just hold on." I wanted to ask how they'd found me, why they'd waited so long if they knew what was happening, but my vocal cords still wouldn't respond, and consciousness was slipping away. The operating room filled with more people, paramedics, and law enforcement and hospital security. Someone was shouting about getting Keeler and his accomplices into custody. Medical equipment beeped urgently as trauma specialists worked to stabilize me. An oxygen mask covered my face, and I felt the gurney moving, being rushed through corridors toward what I hoped was legitimate emergency surgery to repair the damage. The paralytic was wearing off, and I could feel pain in waves, my body's nervous system coming back online to report catastrophic trauma. Someone injected something into my IV, and the world went soft around the edges. A doctor's face appeared above me, an older woman with kind eyes who was saying something about emergency repair and blood transfusions. I tried to stay conscious, to hold on to awareness, but the drugs pulled me under into darkness that felt like drowning. I woke up 3 days later in an intensive care unit with tubes and monitors attached to every part of my body. Austin was asleep in a chair beside the bed, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. When I moved slightly, his eyes opened, and he was instantly alert. "You're awake," he said, standing quickly and pressing the call button for nurses. "Don't try to talk. You've got a breathing tube. The doctor said you'd be okay, but it was close." His voice cracked on the last words, and I could see he'd been crying. A nurse arrived and checked my vitals, while Austin stepped back to give her space. She smiled reassuringly, and said a doctor would be in shortly to explain everything. Austin moved closer again once she left, taking my hand carefully to avoid the IV lines. "The FBI agent said you'd want to know what happened. That woman, Agent Delacroix, she's been here every day checking on you." He paused, collecting himself. They'd been investigating Metropolitan Medical for 8 months. Someone on the staff reported suspicious patterns in surgical deaths and organ donor paperwork. Austin explained that the FBI had built a case gradually, documenting forged death certificates and tracking organ shipments to private buyers overseas. They'd identified Keeler as the primary surgeon, but needed evidence of an actual harvesting operation in progress to make arrests that would hold up in court. When I'd been admitted with suspected appendicitis, someone in the emergency department had flagged my case to federal investigators monitoring the hospital. They'd placed surveillance in the operating room and had been waiting for Keeler to reveal his intentions before intervening. "They said they had to let it go far enough to prove criminal intent," Austin continued, his voice tight with anger. "But they also said if they'd waited any longer, you would have died. The timing was calculated to save your life while gathering maximum evidence." The explanation made sense legally but felt horrifying personally. I'd been used as bait, allowed to be cut open and violated so federal agents could document crimes in progress. The 2 kidneys they'd removed had been recovered and were being stored in case surgical reattachment became possible. But the damage was extensive, and doctors weren't optimistic about successful reimplantation. I'd likely need dialysis for the rest of my life, or eventually require legitimate transplant. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dr. Keeler and his accomplices were in federal custody, facing murder charges, conspiracy, and violation of organ trafficking laws. The investigation had expanded to include 64 previous cases where healthy patients had died during supposedly routine surgeries at Metropolitan Medical. Families were being notified that their loved ones had been murdered for organ harvesting, bodies returned to them incomplete after organs were removed and sold. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Keeler had been running this operation for over a decade, protected by corrupt hospital administrators and a medical examiner who'd falsified death certificates. The network included transplant coordinators, private air transport services, and overseas surgical facilities that asked no questions about organ sources. Financial records showed tens of millions of dollars moving through shell companies and offshore accounts. This wasn't isolated crime, but systematic industry built on murder. Agent Delacroix visited that afternoon, a tall woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She explained that my testimony would be crucial for prosecution, that my experience as a surviving victim provided evidence that previous cases had likely followed similar patterns. "I know this is difficult," she said, "but we need detailed statements about everything Keeler said during the procedure. His admissions to you were recorded by surveillance, but your first-hand account will be powerful in court." I nodded slowly, still unable to speak with the breathing tube. She continued, explaining that the investigation had uncovered buyer networks in 12 countries, wealthy individuals willing to pay premium prices for organs obtained through murder. Many were prominent business people, politicians, even medical professionals who'd convinced themselves that acquiring organs through illegal channels was justified by their important work. The rationalization echoed what Keeler had said about utilitarian selection. These weren't people who saw themselves as murderers. They'd convinced themselves that their lives were more valuable than the donors they were killing. The breathing tube came out 2 days later, and I could finally speak, though my voice was rough and weak. Austin stayed with me constantly, sleeping in the hospital room and advocating with nurses when pain medication wasn't enough. He'd taken leave from his construction job and was surviving on savings while I recovered. The medical bills were catastrophic despite insurance, and I knew Austin was worried about how we'd pay for everything. Agent Delacroix returned once I could talk and recorded hours of detailed testimony about the operating room, everything Keeler had said, the systematic preparation for organ harvesting. She showed me photographs of the nurse, security guard, and administrative coordinator, confirming their identities and roles in the conspiracy. Each person I identified strengthened the federal case. The investigation revealed that Metropolitan Medical's board of directors had known about suspicious mortality rates, but had chosen to ignore them because Keeler brought in substantial revenue through private surgical cases. The hospital's malpractice insurance had paid out settlements to families of previous victims, but administrators had treated these as acceptable business expenses rather than evidence of systematic murder. The complicity extended beyond individual criminals to institutional failure, systems designed to protect patients instead enabling their exploitation. The news media picked up the story and it became national headlines. Organ harvesting operation exposed at major hospital. Prominent surgeon arrested for serial murder. Wealthy buyers sought organs through illegal international network. My face appeared in news coverage as the surviving victim whose testimony had confirmed the scale of the conspiracy. Austin tried to shield me from the attention, but it was impossible to escape. Reporters camped outside the hospital seeking interviews. Social media exploded with outrage and conspiracy theories. Some people questioned whether the story was real, suggesting it was too horrific to be true. Others demanded death penalties for everyone involved. The public reaction was intense and overwhelming. 3 weeks after the surgery, I was transferred to a rehabilitation facility to continue recovery. Physical therapy focused on regaining strength after severe blood loss and surgical trauma. I'd lost significant weight and muscle mass during the hospitalization, and simple tasks like walking to the bathroom left me exhausted. But the physical recovery was easier than the psychological damage. I had nightmares every night about being paralyzed on the operating table, feeling hands inside my body, watching Keeler prepare to remove organs. I'd wake up screaming and Austin would be there, talking me down from panic attacks. The hospital provided trauma counseling, but talking about what happened felt impossible. How do you explain being conscious during your own dismemberment to a therapist who'd never experienced anything comparable? The FBI investigation continued expanding as evidence revealed connections to other hospitals across the country. Keeler's operation was part of a larger network that had been harvesting organs from vulnerable patients for over 20 years. Homeless individuals, undocumented immigrants, foster system adults who had no family to question suspicious deaths. These victims had been selected specifically because their murders would generate minimal investigation. The systematic targeting of society's most vulnerable people added another layer of horror to crimes that were already incomprehensible. Agent Delacroix visited regularly to provide updates on the investigation and prepare me for upcoming trials. Multiple defendants would face separate proceedings, starting with Keeler and the nurse who'd assisted in my harvesting operation. The administrative coordinator had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges, providing detailed testimony about financial arrangements and buyer networks. Her cooperation was invaluable for tracing money and identifying overseas transplant recipients who'd knowingly purchased murdered victims' organs. Some buyers were claiming they hadn't known the organs came from non-consensual sources, that they'd believed they were participating in legal private transplant arrangements. But financial records and communication logs showed explicit discussions about donor selection and systematic harvesting procedures. These weren't innocent people deceived by criminal middlemen. They were active participants who'd knowingly funded murder for their personal benefit. The moral bankruptcy was stunning. Wealthy individuals had convinced themselves that their survival justified any means, including paying for the systematic murder of healthy people whose lives they deemed less valuable. Keeler's trial began 8 months after my surgery. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days, describing everything from the moment he'd locked the operating room door until FBI agents burst in. Defense attorneys tried to suggest I'd been sedated and couldn't accurately remember events, that trauma had distorted my perception. But surveillance recordings corroborated every detail I described, showing Keeler explaining the harvesting operation while preparing surgical instruments. The jury watched footage of him removing organs while I was conscious and restrained. Several jurors looked visibly ill during the playback. Medical experts testified about the skill required to harvest organs without immediately killing the donor, explaining that Keeler's technique demonstrated extensive experience and practice. The coroner, who'd falsified previous death certificates, testified that Keeler had personally instructed her on what complications to list, providing cover stories for each murder. Financial experts traced $38 million through Keeler's accounts over 11 years, money paid by buyers for organs harvested from 64 victims. The evidence was overwhelming and methodical, each piece building an irrefutable case. The defense tried to argue that Keeler had been motivated by desire to help desperately ill transplant recipients who couldn't access organs through legitimate channels. They portrayed him as a misguided idealist who'd crossed ethical lines while trying to save lives. But prosecutors demolished this narrative by presenting evidence that Keeler had personally profited millions while his victims died in agony. This wasn't altruism, but systematic murder for profit. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including first-degree murder, conspiracy, and organ trafficking. Keeler showed no emotion when the verdicts were read, maintaining the clinical detachment he'd displayed in the operating room. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, and the judge imposed multiple life terms without possibility of parole. She said Keeler had betrayed the fundamental trust between doctors and patients, that he'd weaponized medical expertise to enable systematic murder. His crimes represented the worst possible corruption of professional responsibility. Similar trials proceeded for the nurse, security guard, administrative coordinator, and hospital executives who'd enabled the operation. Most received substantial prison sentences, though some secured reduced terms through cooperation. The medical examiner received the harshest sentence after Keeler, 25 years for her role in covering up 64 murders through falsified death certificates. The hospital filed for bankruptcy protection as lawsuits from victims' families overwhelmed their insurance coverage. Metropolitan Medical Center closed permanently, its reputation destroyed beyond recovery. Families of the 64 confirmed victims received settlements from liquidated hospital assets, though no amount of money could compensate for lost lives. I received $4.5 million from the settlement fund, money that paid off medical bills and provided financial security I'd never imagined having. But I'd have traded it all to undo that morning when I'd walked into the emergency department with abdominal pain. The physical recovery took nearly 2 years. I eventually got placed on the transplant waiting list for kidneys, and after 18 months I received a legitimate transplant from a deceased donor who'd registered as an organ donor. The irony wasn't lost on me. That voluntary donation saved my life after involuntary harvesting had nearly ended it. My transplant surgeon was patient and understanding, recognizing the psychological trauma I carried around medical procedures. She took extra time explaining each step, ensuring I felt safe and informed throughout the process. The transplant was successful, and I gradually regained normal kidney function. But I'd never feel completely comfortable in hospitals again. Austin sold his truck to help cover expenses during my unemployment while recovering. I eventually returned to engineering work, but changed companies, unable to face questions from previous coworkers about what had happened. The notoriety followed me, despite attempts to rebuild a normal life. People recognized my face from news coverage and asked invasive questions about the operating room experience. Some were sympathetic, others morbidly curious, treating my trauma as entertainment. I moved to a different city to escape the constant recognition. Agent Delacroix stayed in contact even after the trials concluded, checking on my recovery and providing updates about ongoing investigations into international buyer networks. Several prominent business people had been arrested and faced trials in their home countries for purchasing organs they'd known came from murdered donors. The defense contractor in Singapore received 10 years for his role. The pharmaceutical executive in Dubai died before prosecution, succumbing to dialysis complications while awaiting trial. The media mogul in Hong Kong fought extradition for 3 years before finally being brought to the United States to face charges. His conviction generated international headlines about accountability for wealthy individuals who believed money placed them above law. 3 years after that morning in Metropolitan Medical's operating room, I was testifying before a congressional committee investigating organ trafficking and medical corruption. Legislators wanted to understand how systematic harvesting operations could function for decades without detection. I explained the institutional failures, the complicity of hospital administrators, the selection of vulnerable victims whose deaths wouldn't generate investigation. My testimony contributed to legislation strengthening oversight of organ procurement organizations and requiring independent review of surgical mortality rates, small reforms that might prevent future victims from experiencing what I'd endured. Austin attended the congressional hearing, sitting in the gallery and providing silent support. He'd been my constant advocate throughout recovery and investigation, sacrificing his own stability to ensure I survived. Our relationship had deepened through shared trauma, though I wished circumstances had been different. We'd bought a house together using settlement money, finally achieving the family stability we'd planned. But the cost had been incalculable. I still had nightmares about the operating room, still felt phantom sensations of hands inside my body, still struggled with the knowledge that I'd been minutes from death when FBI agents intervened. The psychological scars were permanent, markers of trauma that would never fully heal. But I'd survived when 64 others hadn't, and I owed it to them to ensure their deaths led to meaningful change. Victim advocacy became my focus, working with organizations that supported families affected by medical violence and organ trafficking. I spoke at conferences about the warning signs of systematic exploitation, the importance of questioning medical authority when something felt wrong. My engineering career took a backseat to advocacy work that felt more meaningful. 4 years after Keeler's conviction, Agent Delacroix called with news that international investigations had identified and shut down harvesting networks in 8 countries. Over 200 people had been arrested and convicted, including surgeons, hospital administrators, organ brokers, and buyers who'd funded the operations. The conspiracy had been even larger than initial investigations revealed, a truly global industry built on systematic murder of vulnerable populations. The scope was staggering and depressing, confirming that evil could function at industrial scale when profit incentives aligned with institutional failures. But the prosecutions also demonstrated that accountability was possible, that wealth and power couldn't indefinitely protect people from consequences of murdering for convenience. Justice moved slowly, but eventually arrived for most perpetrators. I received a letter from Keeler in prison, attempting to justify his actions through philosophical arguments about utilitarian ethics and resource allocation. He claimed I should understand that sacrificing a few to save many was morally defensible, that my suffering had purpose in providing organs that saved lives. I burned the letter without responding, refusing to engage with rationalization that treated human beings as interchangeable parts. Keeler remained imprisoned and unrepentant, a sociopath who'd convinced himself that systematic murder served a greater good. Years passed, and life rebuilt itself around the trauma. I married and had children, though medical procedures during pregnancy triggered severe anxiety that required additional therapy. My wife knew my history and provided patient support through flashbacks and panic attacks. We explained to our kids that Daddy had been very sick once, without providing details about systematic harvesting operations. That conversation could wait until they were older and could process such darkness. Austin became an uncle who visited constantly, maintaining the protective role he'd filled since childhood. Our children grew up knowing they had family who'd sacrificed everything to keep each other safe. The medical community implemented reforms inspired by victims' advocacy and legislative changes. Surgical mortality review became more rigorous, with independent oversight examining deaths that occurred during routine procedures. Organ procurement organizations faced increased scrutiny about donor verification and consent documentation. These changes came too late for the 64 people Keeler had murdered, but they might prevent future systematic exploitation. Small victories that mattered even if they couldn't undo past harm. A decade after I'd walked into Metropolitan Medical's emergency room, I stood at a memorial ceremony honoring victims of organ trafficking and medical violence. 64 names were engraved on a granite monument, people who died believing they were receiving legitimate medical care. Their families stood together sharing grief and anger about lives stolen by people who'd sworn oaths to do no harm. I read victim names aloud during the ceremony, ensuring each person was remembered as an individual rather than a statistic. Austin stood beside me, and Agent Delacroix attended in her official capacity representing law enforcement commitment to accountability. The ceremony provided some closure, acknowledgement that what happened had been real and catastrophic, that victims deserved remembrance and perpetrators faced justice. I carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal, but I'd survived and helped ensure systematic murder ended. That was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.